Hi, and welcome to Talks at Google. I'm Dr. Camila Williams on Google's mental health and well-being team, and I'm so excited that today we get to talk to Dr. Anna Lembke. She is the author of this amazing book, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. Dr. Lembke is a professor of psychiatry at Stanford University School of Medicine and the chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic. She is a prolific author with more than 100 peer-reviewed publications. She has testified before the United States House of Representatives and Congress, and she is an internationally recognized leader in addiction medicine and treatment and education. Her first book, Drug Dealer MD, was named by the New York Times as one of the top 5 books to better understand the opioid epidemic. You might also have seen her in the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, where they take a deeper dive into the impact of social media on our lives. I'm sure you'll have questions of your own for Dr. Lembke today. So remember, at the end of our talk today, we are going to have a Q&A. So please drop your questions into the chat as we go along. We would love to hear from you. Now, enough further ado, let's welcome Dr. Anna Lembke.
Hi, Camilla.
Hi, thank you so much for taking the time to come today.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Excited.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, your subtitle on your book, Age of Indulgence. I'm just kind of curious to help us get to know you a little bit. Do you have like a guilty pleasure that you might indulge in a little bit nowadays?
Oh, of course. I mean, I think in this day and age, we're all struggling with compulsive overconsumption. And in the book, I write about how I got addicted to romance novels. This was about 15 years ago now. It started with the Twilight Saga, which is, for those of your listeners who don't know, it's a vampire romance series for teenagers. And I happened upon it, and it was just absolutely transporting for me for whatever reason. It really just was this wonderful escape. And I read all 4 books, and then read them again. And about a month later, read them again. And then from there, branched out to read a bunch of other vampire romance novels. And then I moved on to like werewolf romance novels. And then it was soothsayer and necromancer romance novels. And ultimately over time, that sort of stopped working, and my progression followed the typical progression for addiction. And again, I don't want to trivialize addiction. Addiction is the continued compulsive use of a substance or behavior despite harm to self and or others. And my addiction was clearly not, a life-threatening problem, and not in the same kind of category of severity as many people who struggle, or as many of my patients struggle. But it was real in that I did get caught up in this kind of escapist behavior that ultimately did begin to interfere with my life, in the sense that I was less present for my husband, less present for my children. I would take, once I got a Kindle, that then accelerated this phenomenon because they were all readily accessible. Mm-hmm. I became really a chain reader. I would stay up late, like 2 a.m, be groggy the next day, so not as able to focus on my work. At one point, I was actually taking romance novels to work and reading in the 10 minutes between patients. So it became a kind of this sort of, I got caught in it, didn't really see it for what it was. And I think one of the really important but subtle manifestations of addiction is the inability then to take joy in other more modest rewards, and a kind of narrowing of our focus on just that activity. And that did happen to me. So other things became less joyful. My work, which had always been a great source of reward, was beginning to be less joyful for me. My relationships, and a kind of developing a kind of like, anxiety, irritability, depression, which are sort of the classic symptoms or sequelae of addictive behaviors over time. So yeah, so that's, it's always a little bit embarrassing to admit it, but that is what happened to me.
Yeah. And I know you mentioned, right, it's something that you kind of get sucked into, right? That You're trying to escape, and it can start with something that seems more benign, and then it just keeps, going from there. And I know how you mentioned, like, it's hard to notice when it's happening in the moment until it starts to kind of really interfere with our lives. I know for me, I can't tell you how many times I've gone to bed and I'm tired. I'm so tired and so ready for sleep. And an hour and a half later, I'm still awake on social media. And it's like, I probably could have used that extra sleep instead of staying up that
Right.
late.
Right. Yeah.
So to help kind of orient our audience today, can you kind of give us a broad overview of Dopamine Nation and kind of some of the main takeaways so that we can better understand a little bit of what you're talking about?
Yeah. So, I mean, the main takeaway from Dopamine Nation is that we are living in an unprecedented time of overwhelming overabundance. Such that we've reached a kind of tipping point where, despite having all of our basic survival needs met and all of these, wonderful things to do and substances to ingest and this amazing food supply, that in fact we are getting progressively more depressed, more anxious, in some cases suicidal. We're experiencing more body pain, despite the fact that the United States consumes 30% of the world's opioids. And if you look at like large epidemiologic surveys, you find that other wealthy nations are experiencing similar trajectories. World happiness surveys show a decrease in happiness in the past 20 to 30 years, with the steepest declines in the wealthiest nations. Likewise, if you track rates of major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, chronic pain, suicide, you find that those rates have been going up steadily over the past 30 years, and they've been going up fastest in rich nations, which is a paradox because we have all of this abundance and yet we're less happy than ever. And the question is why? And it's a question that Dopamine Nation tries to answer on a neurobiological level by looking at what happens to the brain with repeated exposure to highly rewarding substances and behaviors, namely the discovery that we process pleasure and pain in the same parts of the brain and they work like opposite sides of a balance. So the more we expose our brains to highly pleasurable reinforcing activities which release dopamine in the reward pathway, the more likely our brains will compensate by tilting us to the side of pain, decreasing dopamine receptors, decreasing dopamine production, and ultimately putting us into this chronic dopamine deficit state, which is, akin to a clinical depression. And so really kind of conceptualizing modern despair as a result of overabundance, that our brains evolved over millions of years of evolution for a world of scarcity and ever-present danger. We reflexively approach pleasure and avoid pain. But in this world of abundance, our brains are reeling to try to adapt and accommodate all of the pleasurable reinforcers. And they're doing that by essentially putting us into this chronic dopamine deficit state and leading to the despair. And the reason that that's so important is because it suggests very different interventions than what we're traditionally doing for people suffering from emotional distress. So 20 years ago, a patient who came in reporting depression and anxiety, the first thing I would have done was give an antidepressant and then maybe recommended some kind of psychotherapy to try to deconstruct, their early childhood to try to explain their current suffering. Today, the first thing that I do is actually screen them for behaviors that are linked to ingestion of high dopamine rewards, like video games, social media, pornography, cannabis, alcohol, all different kinds of drugs, including prescription drugs. And when I detect that an individual is consuming large amounts with high frequency, especially daily, then I usually recommend an intervention that involves a dopamine fast, or in fact, abstaining from that rewarding substance or behavior for long enough to reset those reward pathways, which on average takes about 4 weeks. Which is interesting because even in some severely addicted people who have been using their drug for many years, if they stop for 4 weeks, they can typically restore enough dopamine firing that they feel considerably improved from the perspective of mood and anxiety just with that intervention alone. So that's kind of the big picture message.
Yeah, thank you for that wonderful overview. There's so much to dig in there. I wanted to kind of start out with this. You mentioned like in the age of this overabundance, and everyone, all these pleasurable things that we can seek out that give us those dopamine hits actually have lower levels of happiness and like increased rates of depression and anxiety, even among the most rich nations. And so one of the things I was wondering is like here in the US, I know we have a global audience today here at Google, but I know that something that's quite American, right, is this, I have the right to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And really this focus on being happy. I know as a mother, I always worry this, I just want my kids to be happy. Like, I just want them to be happy. And it's such like a core part of the culture, at least the culture that I am in. But hearing you say that actually it's this focus on the pleasurable, on those dopamine hits, on like being happy is actually creating this dopamine deficit. What should we be pursuing instead?
Well, I think we have to reconceptualize our notions of freedom. To date, I think we think about freedom as being able to do and say whatever you want to do and say whenever you want to do and say them. And although in the short term, we can experience that as pleasurable and rewarding and maybe even beneficial, in the long term, that doesn't necessarily lead to freedom, because addiction is really the antithesis of freedom. Addiction is being locked into this narrow focus on obtaining, consuming, hiding, recovering from, and obtaining again our drug of choice. And it's just a devastating way to pass through our existence. What people with addiction realize is that freedom comes with abstention, or in some cases, extreme moderation. And that in this world of abundance, what we really need to do is to create a world within a world where we're essentially insulating ourselves to the constant titillation and invitations to consume. In many ways, where we have arrived today is the dark side of capitalism. So capitalism is a wonderful system for leveraging and exploiting people's ingenuity and initiative on an individual level. But to the dark side of capitalism is that we all become the ultimate consumer, and the ultimate consumer is the addict. So I think we're at a point now where we really need to begin to be thoughtful about capitalism and also how we're going to live in a world where it's very clear through technology, innovation, the supply chain, even the poorest of the poor today have more disposable income and more access to luxury goods than ever before in the history of humankind. We have machines that do work for us, which means that we have more leisure time than ever before in the history of humankind. By 2025, we're projected to have up to 7 hours of leisure time per day in rich nations, which is a remarkable achievement in a way. But what we're doing with that leisure time, it turns out, is playing video games and going on Snapchat and smoking pot. So, we need to get creative, because we are literally titillating ourselves to death. When you look at reasons for death all around the world, the top 3 reasons that people are dying today are due to diseases caused by modifiable risk factors. And the top 3 modifiable risk factors are being overweight, smoking, and being sedentary or not moving our bodies. So clearly, we're at a historical tipping point, where people actually need to reroute their intestines in order to lose weight. And that's not a judgment or negative commentary on individuals who get gastric bypass surgery. What it says is that our primitive brain wiring is mismatched for this modern ecosystem.
Yeah, and that's actually reminds me that you had a quote in your book that just really, really stuck out with me. And you say, and I apologize, I'm going to read this. You said,
great.
The evidence is indisputable. Exercise has a more profound and sustained positive effect on mood, anxiety, cognition, energy, and sleep than any pill I can prescribe. That just really hit me. And so, like, why do you think like it's still so hard for people to do the thing they know is going to help them, like exercise?
Yeah, well, I think we need to have a lot of compassion for ourselves, because from an evolutionary perspective, we have evolved over millions of years, and our reward pathway, basically makes this a fact for us to reflexively approach pleasure and avoid pain. We do that without thinking. That is the reflex, and it's what's kept us alive over millions of years. Now it's become a liability, which means that we now have to intentionally and in advance anticipate that we do not want to approach certain types of pleasure, and we actually want to seek out certain types of pain, like exercise in moderation, which function in our brains by actually triggering our brains to sense injury, because exercise is immediately toxic to cells. But if it's not too much exercise, then what happens is it makes us more physiologically resilient by upregulating dopamine production and production of other feel-good neurotransmitters like norepinephrine, serotonin, our endogenous opioid system, and our endogenous cannabinoid system. What you see with exercise is that dopamine levels increase slowly over the very last part of exercise and then remain elevated for hours afterwards before coming back to baseline levels of dopamine firing, which is in stark contrast to ingesting intoxicants, including behavioral intoxicants like digital media, which cause a sudden spike in dopamine followed by dopamine free fall, not just to baseline levels, but actually below baseline levels before going back up to the level position. That below baseline is the dopamine deficit state. And with repeated exposure, what happens is we eventually don't come back up to baseline levels. We end up chronically at a lower level of dopamine firing, which again is, I think, what is contributing to our individual and collective misery.
Yeah. And so it's just kind of like you mentioned, a bit of a paradox, right? It's not what I would logically assume. Doing something that's initially toxic to my cells at the very start is actually what helps me have that sustained longer term dopamine release. Whereas seeking out an addictive substance or behavior will give me a spike, but then I've got that drop at the end. That's so interesting.
Yeah. And what I think, again, this is where we have to sort of have compassion for ourselves too, that our brains are wired to have a very vivid and accurate memory of the initial stimulus, either the initial pleasure or the initial pain. But what we're not good at remembering is the after effect, or what's sometimes called the opponent process mechanism. So we're not good at remembering that too much pleasure leads to pain, and we're not good at remembering that repeated pain can give us pleasure. Like when I wake up in the morning, every morning it's a battle to tell myself to get out of bed and go on a walk or go swim or get some sort of modest exercise. It's like I literally cannot remember how good I feel after the exercise, which is why then we have to talk about these things and create collective narratives as reminders, because physiologically, I am not able to remember this. But by collecting narratives and talking about it and reminding each other, creating cues for ourselves to remind ourselves, oh, that's why I do that, we can manage to overcome, this ancient wiring. But it's hard.
Yeah. When you're talking about memory, I'm just like, I don't normally think of like a lot of the things I do as maybe addictive. And I can imagine a lot of people are like, well, it's not like, I'm drunk, for example. But like trying to like really put it into perspective and remember how these things are impacting us. I know a lot of us might say, oh, I can stop anytime. And I'll see out there a lot of like these social media challenges, right? Like no tech Tuesdays, like turn off all your devices, go one day without it, or fasting from social media, like delete all the apps, like spend 1 week without going on it. Is this, helpful or harmful because you mentioned like it takes 4 weeks of abstaining.
Yeah. So once people have become, addicted, you really need to abstain for 4 weeks to reset reward pathways. And then we always talk about, after the dopamine fast, making a very specific plan about how to re-engage if you want to re-engage, or how to continue to abstain if the goal is to abstain. And less than that, generally isn't enough time in somebody who's seriously addicted, but might be enough time in somebody who is just compulsively over-consuming, which is, I would say, most of us at this point. But I think even a single day of a digital fast or an abstinence from whatever your drug of choice is can be instructive, even if it's not enough to reset reward pathways. It might be enough to let us know how compulsive the behavior has become. So I actually am heartened to see people joining together to do a digital fast or a digital Sabbath, or taking a day break or a few days or a week, whatever they can manage from either the device itself or certain apps on the device or certain websites. I think committing to it in advance, preparing for the dopamine fast, letting other people know to the extent that you're comfortable, engaging in self-binding strategies where you create both literal and metacognitive barriers between yourself and your drug of choice so that you can press the pause button between desire and consumption, Once that drug is in front of us, very difficult to say no to it once we've built up that kind of automatic compulsive behavior. So yeah, I mean, I think it's useful to do that. Obviously, wouldn't recommend a dopamine fast or quitting cold turkey in somebody who is at risk, for example, for life-threatening alcohol withdrawal, right? Or life-threatening benzodiazepine withdrawal, like from Xanax. But even people, even people who are quite addicted to alcohol and benzodiazepines, most of them will not experience life-threatening withdrawal. So can, at least safely try to do the dopamine fast. We also wouldn't recommend this in somebody with a serious addiction who had repeatedly tried to quit on their own. Those people need a higher level of care, for example, going to a residential treatment facility, sometimes referred to as rehab. But I'm very grateful for rehabs, because for my patients who literally just cannot stop in the environment in which they're living in, going to that kind of environment where they don't have access to their drugs allows them to reset reward pathways, get their frontal lobe back online, and then actually make an informed decision about what they want to do next. A lot of times people say, well, you can't, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. You can't get somebody to stop using unless they hit rock bottom and don't want to use. But the truth of the matter is, when people are deep in their addiction, they actually lose the ability to choose. They're not able to process information. And so getting them off of the drug for long enough to restore those cognitive functions and to get them out of that vortex of compulsive overuse is critical for allowing them to engage their autonomy and decision-making capacity to decide whether or not they want to stop using.
Yeah, I think that's so important, right? Remembering that, when you're that deep into an addiction, it's not really a choice. You're not in control. And that's why you have to be even more diligent about all the structure around you to kind of help you.
Right, the structure, getting help. I mean, there is some choice there for many. Even the most severely addicted person still has on some level a choice to get help or not. To recognize they can't do it on their own and get help. So, but I think it is important for people to realize that people with very, very severe addictions, they want to stop and they're really not able to without help.
Yeah. It's also reassuring to know that even a small, like one day, just to help give us insight into our own behaviors. I know I can share, I got called to jury duty and I had to sit in the courtroom, and I thought, this is great. I had all these books I wanted to read on my phone, and they're like, no phones in the courtroom, no recording devices. And I was crawling out of my skin because it was 8 hours of not, like, just the habit of, like, any downtime. I didn't realize how much of a habit. Oh, downtime, check email. Oh, downtime, check messages.
Right.
Oh, downtime, check social media.
Right.
And not being able to do that. Like, I came home that day and I was so irritable. And it was just the insight of, like, okay, I am more attached to this device than I realized. And so I'm wondering, what is your advice then if we are trying to abstain from something that we are attached to or addicted to, like our smartphones? But that we can't categorically avoid. Like, I still need my phone for work and emails and calls and messages, but maybe I'm dependent on it too much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So first of all, thanks for sharing that. I think that's really helpful, for folks to hear, because the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance are psychological symptoms, and they are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving. So whatever the drug is, including behaviors, addictive behaviors like our devices and digital content, we will experience withdrawal if our brains have become habituated to daily use. And by the way, these are drugs. So they do stimulate, clearly, brain imaging shows that they stimulate the dedicated part of the brain called the reward pathway, which is rich in dopamine releasing neurons. We know that the more dopamine that's released and the faster that it's released, the more likely that an individual is to get addicted. People have drug of choice. So in your case, it might be social media. In my case, it's romance novels. Somebody else, it's cannabis. Somebody else, it's alcohol. But basically what I counsel people to do is to figure out what their drug of choice is, that thing that they engage in out of control, compulsive use, including continued use despite consequences, that thing that they get lost in. They always say they're going to cut back, and then they don't do it. And essentially to, again, ideally begin with a fast. And, we need our devices for work. I totally get that. So maybe it's not getting rid of the device altogether, but maybe it's a particular website or a particular activity. Maybe it's online pornography, right? We see a lot of that. Or maybe it's video games, or maybe it's social media. So the commitment would be whatever the drug is, but otherwise be using the phone for other things. Now, in order to reduce temptation, you need to delete the apps that allow you to have access to that particular digital drug. And you need to be aware that when you first stop it, you will go into withdrawal and you will feel restless and uncomfortable. But that's not the kind of discomfort that you're going to be left with in the long term. That is withdrawal mediated discomfort. It lasts about 10 to 14 days. This is for all drugs, again, including sugar, for example. But once you get to about day 10 or 14, you really turn the corner. The sun starts to come out. It gets easier. And then every day, people tend to feel a little bit better, less preoccupied with wanting to use. And by 4 weeks, 80% of folks endorse feeling significantly better and much less mentally preoccupied with their drug of choice. So then the question becomes, okay, am I going to continue to abstain, or am I going to go back to using pornography, video games, cannabis, alcohol, whatever it is? And the key, when going back to using, is to make a detailed plan. Okay, so the devil is in the details. When am I going to use? How much? How often? Because quantity and frequency and potency really matter. Okay, so the more of a drug we use and the more often we use it, the more likely we are to get addicted to it. So what we need to think about is having non-using days in a given week. We have to try to avoid highly potent forms, or if we use highly potent forms of our drug, use them in extreme moderation. We don't want to get into a binge pattern either, because that's just as bad for our brains as a daily heavy use. So it's thinking about, okay, if it's alcohol, all right, when am I going to drink? Maybe it's going to be Friday, Saturday, or maybe Saturday, Sunday. How many drinks am I going to have? What am I going to drink? In what situations am I going to drink? How am I going to keep track of it? What are going to be my red flags that I'm slipping? So those are the types of things, working with somebody, a friend or a workbook or a healthcare professional, to really come up with a detailed commitment to a plan after a period of abstinence. Now, when we're talking about workaholism, that's a tricky one, right? Because then there's this rationalization that, wow, well, this is work. I have to be doing this. And also, there are a lot of ways in which our society rewards work, but work can definitely be an addiction. Compulsively checking email is a common symptom. I'm certainly guilty of that at times. And I think we have to do the same thing. We have to really take a break from work, whether it's a digital Sabbath or 1 day a week. I mean, that's why the Sabbath has been a tradition, in many religions for centuries. This idea that it's good for us to take a break, a day when we commit to not working, or maybe, in the form of a vacation and making it tech-free or at least low-tech. And then coming back kind of renewed with then a commitment around, okay, what are the kind of guardrails or boundaries I'm going to put around this behavior, including work, to help myself not compulsively engage? Because what happens with addiction is that we become very two-dimensional, and we isolate, and we don't value our human connections and the other things that I think at the end of the day and at the end of a life we're really going to care about, right? Those types of things. But we can lose perspective on that when we're constantly engaging in work. But by forcing ourselves to abstain, you kind of go away and you realize, wow, I don't know, I overvalued that. I thought that seemed so important when I was in it. But I really realize now, who really cares? And if I'm not there, someone else will take care of it. So that kind of thing.
Yeah, that was something that really struck out in your book when you were talking about workaholism. Is there aren't that many addictions out there that I can think of, at least, where you actually get rewarded for being addicted to it. And especially in white collar jobs, and in the tech industry, you get rewarded, with bonuses and all that, the more output you have in your work. And so it just makes it that much harder to detach from work. And you mentioned kind of really reassessing, I thought that was way more important than it actually was, and really thinking about what's important in our lives. One of the things that you mentioned that I wanted to ask you a little bit more about is the why. You gave us an acronym for dopamine, which I love it. We probably don't have time to go into the whole acronym, but you said the O is for the objective, and part of recovery is really understanding what was driving the why behind the behavior. And so I'm just curious if you could give us some examples of like modern day addictions and kind of what drives those behaviors. What are people usually seeking when they engage in that?
Well, typically people will describe starting using a substance for one of two reasons, either to have fun or to solve a problem. The problem can be very wide ranging, from trying to self-medicate, depression, anxiety, insomnia, poor concentration, social phobia, you name it, to just things like loneliness and boredom. I mean, boredom is a huge problem in the modern age. And of course, the more we use our drug of choice, the more boring a life becomes, right? The more we're on the internet, the more impoverished our in-person interactions can become because we're not investing in them. So these are the kind of typical reasons that people will use, and also just general escapism, escaping from self. I think we're such a narcissistically preoccupied culture, and this is very modern and new, that people are as preoccupied with themselves and their own identity building. So we need a break from ourselves, right? We are exhausted by our own, relentless self narrative and self critique and self aggrandizement, and so drugs in all their myriad forms are a way to just simply not be for a while and escape ourselves. Those are common reasons.
Yeah. And you mentioned like rather than medicating or trying to escape ourselves or our suffering, that a path to recovery might actually be learning to embrace the pain. Right? You talk about that pain and pleasure balance, and this is like pushing on the pain side. Can you
Right.
explain to us like why does that work?
Yeah. So, I mean, I remember recently one of my patients said that he got into recovery when he got more tired of running than he did of just turning and facing the pain. And whether the problem is addiction or another life struggle, I think, you get old enough and you realize you can never outrun it. So at some point you just have to turn and kind of face the pain and absorb it, experience it. And paradoxically, when we do that, the pain kind of lessens. So it's a really fascinating phenomenon, I think, that's been described by many of my patients. I've experienced it myself. And then, just learning to sit and tolerate the pain, realize that all of these emotions will eventually exhaust themselves without our having to do anything at all. So our reflex when we're experiencing an uncomfortable emotion is to try to get rid of it. And that is how we are wired. And so, we don't need to judge ourselves about that, but we need to recognize that we do that. And yet there's no winning that game. At some point we're not going to be able to outrun it. And we just have to stop and turn. And in fact, trying to outrun it usually adds to our problems. So just kind of facing the pain, absorbing it, acknowledging it, feeling it, is really key. The other thing that we can do is actually intentionally invite pain into our lives. And as I described before, there's this pleasure-pain balance that wants to remain level. Our brains will work hard to restore homeostasis with any deviation from neutrality. And the way our brains do that is first by tilting an equal and opposite amount to whatever the initial stimulus is. And again, with repeated exposure to pleasure, for example, our brains end up chronically tilted to the pain side. I like to imagine that as these neuroadaptation gremlins that are just accumulating on the pain side of the balance. Now, if we abstain for long enough and face our pain, those gremlins hop off, homeostasis is restored. But the other thing that we can do is intentionally press on the pain side, and then those gremlins hop on the pleasure side in order to bring it level again. And they stay on until it's tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pleasure before hopping off and restoring homeostasis. And that's what we were talking about before. Exercise can do that. Ice cold water baths, intermittent fasting, cleaning out your closet, meditation, prayer, any effortful activity that requires us to pay for our dopamine up front is going to give our dopamine indirectly. Very hard to remember, as I talked about. But again, these collective narratives can serve as a kind of extended hippocampus for all of us to just remind ourselves again and again, oh yeah, if I have this piece of cake right now, I'm going to feel sick later, even though it's going to taste really good in the moment. And likewise, conversely, if I go out for a walk now, it's going to set me up, make me feel much better the rest of the day, even though I really, really don't want to do it. So, this kind of getting ourselves to do the hard things and things we don't want to do, and doing it in an established pattern, but not too much. So So this is the science of hormesis. Lots and lots of interesting animal studies and human studies showing that when we intentionally expose ourselves to toxic or noxious stimuli, we actually trigger the body to upregulate our feel-good hormones and neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. And it's a much more enduring way to get our dopamine, again, because we don't go into that craving or dopamine deficit state. But if we expose ourselves to too much pain, like cutting on ourselves, which releases our endogenous opioids, then we've essentially undermined hormesis. Hormesis is Greek for to set in motion. What we're setting in motion is the healing mechanism. But if we harm ourselves up front, yeah, we'll get a flooding of endogenous opioids and endogenous neurotransmitters, but then we'll exhaust them and there won't be anything left for the repeated exposure. And then cutting on ourselves is obviously not good, or starving ourselves too much, or the kinds of anhedonia that you can see in people who repeatedly pursue adrenaline sports or who overtrain for exercise exposure, and eventually just wear out that balance. And no matter then how much, how many airplanes they jump out of, or how many miles they run, or how many times they cut themselves, they don't get the response anymore. So we're not looking for that kind of pain.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I actually really appreciated about your book and your style of writing, is that you took all these really complex topics of, neurochemistry and all that, and you made it so easy to understand. Like, I felt smart reading, like, I get this. And so it was just wonderfully written, just how you explain all of these topics in your book.
Oh, great. Well, I'm glad you felt smart reading it, because that my goal is to make it, accessible to people at a level that, anybody could understand. So including myself.
And so I do want to remind our audience that we are going to have a Q&A. So if anyone has any questions, to please drop it into the chat. We would love to hear from you. But I did have one more question for you,
Sure.
Dr. Lembke, and it's about kind of imposter syndrome. So I know this is something that myself and a lot of Googlers struggle with. And in your book, you talk about honesty, like learning to be really honest with ourselves as a key part of recovery from any kind of addictive behavior. And I keep thinking, like, imposter syndrome kind of feels like this dishonesty, where there's a mismatch between how I think everyone at work sees me and how I see myself. And sometimes that incongruence just might make me want to, like you said, make that feeling go away. And I might engage in behaviors that are not as good for myself in the long term. So how does that idea of imposter syndrome fit within your model?
Well, the average adult tells 1 to 2 lies per day. So we're all kind of natural liars. We tend to lie to cover up our sort of mistakes or our selfishness, things like why we're late for the meeting. We might say, oh, there was traffic, instead of, sorry, I'm late, I wanted to grab a coffee. But what I propose as an exercise for my patients, but also try to do it myself in my own life and recommend it for others, is to try to go through a whole day and not tell a single lie, not even the merest exaggeration. And it turns out it's really hard to do, because naturally we use words to sort of, as a weapon and a shield in life. But I think there are many advantages to telling the truth, but one of the advantages is that we can feel more real in ourselves. I think there are many ways that we feel unreal in the world today. The amount of time we spend in the virtual world can contribute to this feeling of irreality or depersonalization, derealization, which has historically been associated with extreme anxiety, but is becoming more common and prevalent today. So how do we retether ourselves to the earth and feel more grounded in ourselves? One of the ways we can do that is to not lie, because lying really undermines, that feeling of being real in the world. And then, we think, gosh, if I'm like putting forth, even in small ways, a sort of fake version of myself, that's going to then contribute to my anxiety about not being good enough, which is essentially the imposter syndrome, where people are really measuring themselves against their impressions of themselves. It's not really so much other people's impressions. It's like, well, I feel like this stuff that I know, I'm really a phony and I don't know it, or, I don't know it in a deep enough way or a true enough way. So little things like being truthful about a lot of little things can really help promote a sense of being true and real in the world, especially if we're disclosing, our mistakes and our shortcomings, and seeing that people, contrary to what we think, which is that they're going to go running or say, oh, you're gross, I don't want to have anything to do with you. people are drawn to us when we admit, our shortcomings, because they see in us, their own humanity, and there's a kind of a shared empathy.
Mm-hmm.
So it really promotes, intimacy as well. So I think that, and again, just importantly too, not spending too much on time online, not curating a false persona online.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to have connections with real people in the real world, being your real self. And then I think, especially for tech workers, what I see a lot of in tech workers is a kind of overemphasis on rational thought and a disengagement from. And I don't talk about this in my book, but I think it's important, a kind of disengagement from their emotional selves. And when I think when we disconnect from our emotional selves, we're much more prone to feel unreal. So it's also reconnecting with our emotions and processing them and linking them up to our rational minds that can help with that.
Yeah, you're kind of like being honest about what we're really feeling. Thank you.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, I find one of my biggest challenges with telling the truth is that when I tell a story as it really happened, I often have the feeling that I'm not going to be interesting enough, or it's not going to be good. So the tendency to slightly exaggerate is there, even if I might say, oh, I really only had to wait for someone for 5 minutes, but I might say, and I waited for 20 minutes, because 5 minutes doesn't sound exciting enough, right? But 20 minutes, oh my goodness. But I think that's ultimately destructive, and not helpful. And it's okay to just say 5 minutes, but it felt like 20.
Well, thank you. And we do have a few audience questions, if
Great.
we can jump over to those. Yeah. So Ted is asking, you talked about how hard it is to learn to expect pleasure from exercise, and said cultural narratives and setting up cues can help. I can't do much about narratives, so can you talk about cues?
Sure. So cues would be things like, after you exercised, writing down on a piece of paper how you felt afterwards, and then putting that right next to your bedside table, or carrying it around in your wallet. Or maybe if you guys are all tech savvy, having it come up as a kind of reminder. So a kind of, prompting you to remember, like a little reminder prompt. Other cues would be things like setting up your whole bag and everything the night before, all the stuff that you need to go and exercise, so that you, with intentionality beforehand, plan for it and, get everything in a row, and you put in that effort. So when you wake up the next morning and you do not want to go exercise, you're like, well, but I packed my bag, I might as well go. Or even just putting it on your calendar. So what I find is, if I put on my, little Outlook calendar, swim 6 a.m. to 7 a.m., and I do that the day before, I am much more likely to swim the next morning from 6 a.m. because there it is on my calendar, and I just do whatever my calendar tells me to do. So those are the types of cues that can be helpful.
Wonderful. Then we have a few more questions. Yes, Sina is asking, how much of addiction is related to the 4 givens of the human condition: death, meaning, isolation, and freedom?
Ooh, that's great. So, Sina, I would have said that 200 years ago, those might be the primary reasons for addiction, including an innate biological vulnerability for addiction. But today, I think those have less relevance than they did for our risk susceptibility. Those are really important for modern day people. We certainly are living in a crisis of meaning, in large part, I think, because we don't really pay attention to death and our all inevitable death the way that we need to. But I think that the biggest risk factor today is simple access to drugs. If you grow up in a neighborhood where drugs are sold on the street corner, we've long known that you're more likely to use drugs and more likely to get addicted to drugs. And we are now growing up in an environment where we have constant access to an infinite quantity of highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors, and they literally chase us down. We cannot even not be exposed to them, which means that we have to put up barriers and walls. So certainly, these crises of meaning and death and et cetera, those existential things are important, and they tend to play a role sort of in the more advanced stages of recovery, where we're not escaping anymore from this nagging suspicion that, oh my God, I'm going to die. But in the initial stages of recovery, the biggest thing to focus on is actually simple access, trying to just get the drugs away from us so that we can exercise enough willpower to abstain from long enough to get our brains back online and develop, kind of a spiritual practice, frankly, that then allows us to look at some of those deeper things.
I really want to thank you for your time today. I want to thank our audience for tuning in.
Yep, thanks
I
for
want to remind
coming.
everyone, check out her book, Dopamine Nation. Where can they find you or contact you?
Well, this is not going to be a surprise, but I am not on social media. So the best way to learn about me is you can find out a lot about me, probably more than you ever wanted to know, by reading my book, Dopamine Nation. It's also available on Audible for people who are like to listen instead of read. And it's also been translated into 25 languages now. So it's available all over.
Wonderful. Thank you once again for coming. I hope everyone has a wonderful time, and we'll see you at the next Talks at Google.
Thanks, Camila.